Okay, I want to address the question that was brought to me by people that wanted to know why. And in all honesty, the primary reason when I first made the conscious decision to do this, it was selfish. It was something that has been, as I mentioned, on my mind, on my heart for many, many years. The timing is right, yes, but there are so many layers to this discussion. I was kind of happy when, this is going to sound very weird, but kind of happy when I got the call a couple days ago saying, hey, by the way, we have a funeral mass luncheon. I said, okay, good. Because this could go on longer than the Passion and the Crucifixion. We're looking at, we'll be talking about 18 hours here, and I don't think this is indisputable. Whether you are a Christian or not, whether you are an atheist, an agnostic, whether you believe Christ lived or did not live, this has got to be the most important 18 hours in human history. It has changed everything. It changed everything. Everything that happened before that became true, that was predicted. We'll talk about some of the symbolism that goes through this process, these 18 hours, and everything that came after that was totally different. It just changed everything. The primary impetus, I think the hook that I wanted to sing first had to do with the medical, the scientific part of this. The theological part goes without saying. The history is, I'm kind of a history geek, and it is, we are hard, obviously we can't time travel. We don't have, really good evidence of exactly what happened. But if you think about it, if you can time travel and just observe something, is there anything you would rather observe than this? The symbolism of the forensic part of it as well, that kind of relates to the scientific and medical. The personal part of it to me has to do with this. March of 1986, I'm a fourth-year medical student. I am about a week away from what we call match day. And match day is a dating game for medical students. You're a fourth-year medical student. You put in your applications where you're going to do your residency, where you're going to spend your next, in my case, my next 6 years. That was going to set the tone for my career, my practice, my life. I'm married. I have a 2-year-old, check that, 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And 3 more yet to come, but I didn't know about them yet. And to say I'm nervous, to say I'm anxious, to say that I am just absolutely beside myself, staring at the ceiling thinking, okay, I have no money in the bank, I got a wife, I got 2 kids, I got a little shack of a house that I'm paying $90 a month for, in Alabama, without air conditioning. Can it get any worse? Well, so then I go to the library, it's about a week before match day, and believe it or not, because you wouldn't see it in this journal nowadays, this is an article from the AMA Journal, from the Journal of the American Medical Association. This was the lead article, March 21st, 1986. And it was at the same time that, one of the reasons that CMA exists, one of the reasons the Guild exists, is it is difficult in today's culture, in today's climate, from a medical and culture aspect, to keep your faith intact. And this is what I needed at that point in time to get me back on track. To look at this coming out at that time, that was, Easter was early April, late March, early April that year. So here we are, almost 40 years to the day that I found this, and if there's not providence involved in this, I don't know what is. But anyway, this was an article written by a pathologist at the Mayo Clinic, along with a medical graphics illustrator and a Methodist minister in a small town outside of Rochester. And this is basically the summation of a significant amount of other information. There are, with the internet obviously, there are millions of words written about the Passion and the Crucifixion. The better respected ones, the ones that are really based on fact and not on supposition, not on personal opinion, there's only about 50 of them that I really emphasize for this review. The first really medical-oriented discussion was Stroud, who was a Scottish physician in 1847. We'll relate to him as we go forward. The chronology of Jesus' life, being born, you'd think that, okay, BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini, but it probably either born in 4 BC or 6 BC. And if you look at the historical documents from the time of his death, it's not indisputable, but it seems relatively clear that he died in the year 30 AD. And if you go back in the calendar, in 30 AD, Thursday night and Friday would have been April 6th and April 7th. On the Jewish calendar, that's known as 13 Nisan and 14 Nisan. And Nisan is the first month of the Jewish religious year, the ecclesiastical year. And I think it's a little bit of an irony if you watched Gibson's Passion of the Christ. What's Jesus' name in the movie? In Aramaic, it's Yeshua. But the other name for Nisan in the Hebrew history is Chodesh HaYeshua, the month of salvation. And to me, there are several ironies between the Hebrew history and Christ's death with that. I want to start on Thursday night. In the upper room, this is Jerusalem about the year Jesus would have been born. The upper room is here. It is a walled city. You can tell, here's the high rent district, here's the low rent district. All the spaces here, look at everything crowded through there. Population of Jerusalem at that time would have been about the population of Moline, somewhere in the 40 to 50,000 range. Jesus starts here in the upper room. This is what's felt to be the upper room today, commonly known in Jerusalem as the cenacle or the cenaculum. The upper room is here and where the Last Supper was at. And one thing we also have to think about is what was Jesus' physical condition. I don't know, I was thinking about this as I put this together. By no means a biblical scholar, far from it. But in the New Testament, is there any time that Jesus is going from one place to another when he isn't walking, other than coming into Jerusalem? When he comes in on the donkey. I think granted, he's not riding a bike or anything, but he's walking, he's raised as a carpenter. His time in the desert, he had to be, 40 days in the desert, he had to be in at least above average physical condition. So to be able to tolerate what we're going to be talking about requires some kind of endurance. And then you think about the factors that are involved in this. Emotional stress, we'll talk about the garden. The spiritual torment, we'll talk about the 7 last words. The abandonment, not only are his disciples falling asleep on him, they're running away from him. He doesn't get any sleep through this whole process. He's beaten several times. And even before he carries the cross, he's walked at least 2.5 miles. Now, the garden, so he goes from the upper room to the garden. That's one of the longer walks he'll have to take. And Gethsemane comes from the Hebrew word gachmanim, which means oil press. It's an olive grove, and there was an oil press in the garden. And through the Old Testament into the New Testament, the symbolism for oil is the symbol of the Holy Spirit. And so you can translate that, what's going on in the garden, God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit being crushed. Why would it be called the agony in the garden? And interestingly, in the King James Version, translated from the original Greek, it's the only time the word agony appears in the King James Version. And the Greek translation of the word agony does not mean suffering, it means engaged in combat. And if you think about it, I'm going to make references back to Gibson's movie, though, in that opening scene in the garden, where the devil, that androgynous character, the devil that's there with him, is you can just get that tension, that sense of it is a combat, it is a battle. One of the first medical parts of this is this called hematohydrosis or hemohydrosis, and it is a medical condition. In World War I, in London, there were 2 case reports of 2 ladies that had hematohydrosis during bombing raids. There was another case report in World War II. There is a saint, and I'm blocking on the name now, that developed hematohydrosis when she was being persecuted Basically, blood accumulates in the dermal layer, the deeper layer where the sweat glands and hair follicles are located. And under stress, the blood can be released more commonly through the sweat glands than in the hair follicles. And I think it's no small thing that the discussion of this is in Luke's gospel. And as we know, St. Luke, the patron saint of physicians, is the only one with a medical background. If there's a book I can recommend to you that is historical fiction, it's called Dear and Glorious Physician. It was written in the 1950s, but it is basically a historical, it's a fictional biography of St. Luke, but his discussion of this, he's a very, very well-trained physician, trained in Alexandria, and he was the only non-Jew of the apostles, and he was the only one that never met Jesus face to face. All of his work is written on secondhand information. Judas's betrayal. In this day and age, if I get my finger cut off and the surgeon put it back on, I don't know of any previous replantation story. You know, when Peter cuts off the Roman soldier's ear and Jesus puts it back on. But Judas's betrayal, abandonment is one thing, all the other apostles. But Judas's betrayal, obviously, Jesus was divine, Jesus was human. And the emotional part of this, knowing long before this happened, you know from the Last Supper that he knew what Judas was going to do, and he told him to go do it. You know, he basically signed for a death warrant. From there, he's gone so far from the upper room, all the way through here, through the gates, to the garden. And then he's taken to, before he goes to Caiaphas' residence, right back close to the upper room, somewhere about here is where the home of Annas is at. And Annas used to have Caiaphas' position. Caiaphas is the current high priest. He was the previous high priest. There's no evidence as to why he was knocked down from that post. But interestingly, Annas is Caiaphas' father-in-law. So, going to the older guy first. So, and on the way there, we would strongly suspect Jesus was beaten. On the way there, he was roughed up while he was there as well. Annas sends him on to Caiaphas, and that's the first place where an official charge of blasphemy is given. He stays there until before daylight. He leaves in the middle of the night, but through the night he's beaten. I think it was 25 years ago at a road construction site south of the old city of Jerusalem. This was found. It's a stone container that is an ossuary, which means a collection of bones. Anything OSS means bones. And you can't see it very well, but on this end in here, in Hebrew, is the word Caiaphas. And it's with the archaeological work done at this site, it is strongly suspected that these are indeed the bones of Caiaphas, the high priest. First time he goes before the Sanhedrin, and to be sure, there are two separate Sanhedrins, two separate assemblies. The first he goes before is more or less the political, administrative, civil law. And keep this in mind, he's there at night. Once again, he's charged with blasphemy. And this is where you read that he was blindfolded, he would be struck, and he would be mocked. Who hit you? Tell us, prophesy. Who hit you with that? So as the abuse continues. And then just after daybreak, the sun comes up, he goes on his second trial. And this is before the religious Sanhedrin. And in the temple is a huge structure. And this little red rectangle right there is the chamber of hewn stones. And this is the way it was set up. There were 71 wise men, sages, led by the Nasi, who was the prince, and the Av Bet Din. Basically think president and vice president were the leaders here. You would have 35 of them over here, 35 here, and the high priest in the center. This was the student section, for all the rabbinical students that would sit and watch, and the recordings of the procedures were done here by the clerks. Now, I want to talk, not to make a legal mess out of this, but if you look at the Jewish law at that time, there were several transgressions that clearly occurred. One, Jesus was found charged and found guilty of blasphemy in the high priest's palace. You could only have a trial in the chamber. Two, no trials on these events. He had a trial at night. He's guilty, but in Jewish law, you can only be found guilty the day after the trial. He's found guilty at the time of his appearance. 2 plus witnesses. Deuteronomy and even in Mark, you have to have at least 2 people agree. The statement in Mark's gospel is there was no one to corroborate the same story. Everybody had a different story. There were no arrests that were allowed at night by Jewish law. The Sanhedrin could only investigate charges. They couldn't start the charges. The charges changed during the trial. We'll talk a little bit about that. He had no defense permitted. That violates Jewish law as well. And importantly, the Sanhedrin, at that point in time, was not allowed to convict or pronounce for a death sentence. There is one of the references that I looked at. It's the Encyclopedia Judaica. It's basically an Encyclopedia Britannica for the Jewish faith. And there's a statement in there that as of the year 30 AD, this is in the Jewish literature, up until that time, the Sanhedrin was allowed to pronounce a death sentence. But in that same year, the year we think that Christ died, was the year they were not allowed, or they didn't allow themselves to do that anymore. So, if that's not ironic, if it's true, that's true. So, they know that they really can't do anything without the Romans' involvement. So, he's sent to Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea. And I get this, I try not to read between the lines too much. It's Holy Scripture, and there's not much you can dispute, but I get the distinct impression in my heart that, Pontius Pilate really just didn't want to have anything to do with this. This was not something he was worried about his relationship with Rome and what his job security was. If you get fired from this job, you're dead. There's no rehabilitation for that. The high priest, the Sanhedrin, knew that blasphemy didn't mean anything to the Romans. It's not a theological, it's not a religious-based society. So this is where they change the charges. They go to Pontius Pilate and they say, this guy says he's a king. And he's trying to get everybody riled up. And if you do that, if you forbid that the Jewish people pay tribute to Caesar, it's sedition, it's treason. Those are both charges punishable by death under Roman law. So maybe Pilate is still thinking, I really don't want to deal with this. You know what? You're from Galilee. Herod is the tetrarch of Judea, which includes go. You go to him, let him take care of it. And Herod was happy to see him because he'd heard a lot about him. And back in the old original Jesus Christ Superstar, that kind of almost a tap dance routine, He's just so happy to see him, and, would you walk on water for me? Well, not to make too much light of it, but he was hoping that Jesus would do something miraculous for him. Obviously, nothing happened. Jesus responds that it's you that I say I'm a king, and that's basically his only words. So there's no official charge. There's no evidence that he was mistreated or physically abused while he was seeing Herod. And I think one of the ironies that goes with this part of the story, too, is you have the most powerful Jewish figure in the area who wants a miracle but doesn't get it. But Jesus can walk down the street and see the lowest beggar who isn't even thinking about a miracle. He's thinking, I just want to live. And he takes care of that guy. To me, that is the life of Jesus in a nutshell right there. It's not the high and mighty, it's the low and weak. Now, so then he's taken back he's gone from Caiaphas, he's gone to Pilate up here at the fortress. He goes over here to Herod, goes back there. So now he's in the Praetorium. And even before he sees Pilate again, there are indications that he was likely beaten yet another time, caned or staved. A big wooden cane or stave, if you've seen a barrel, with the staves that are lashed together. They would use those for beatings as well. And this is all before he's scourged. He's got his 2.5 miles in now. And here we are, we're at about 9 o'clock in the morning. So we're 12 hours into this. He's walked 2.5 miles. He hasn't slept. He's been beat up. He has not had anything we know. Nothing he's had to eat or drink in that interim. The Praetorium, this is what felt to be the Praetorium in Jerusalem today. These are the original rough-hewn stones that would be on the floor. And the scourging itself, when Pilate orders him to be scourged, the fortress of Antonia is where this would have occurred. Today, the area is known as the Lithoskratos. And on the floor of that, you'll see these carvings in the stone. And these are games that Roman soldiers would play. So there's not much doubt that there was something that the Roman soldiers had the legionaries had a lot to do in this area. And this is most likely the region where the scourging took place. The Roman protocol for scourging was, Romans were exact. They wanted to do everything by the book to a point. And if you were going to be executed by the Romans, under Roman law, you were scourged first, unless you were a woman, you were a Roman senator, or a soldier. If you were a soldier that had deserted and joined the enemy, and then they caught you, and the scourging was about as bad as it could be. The scourging itself, at least the third, if not the fourth, or maybe the more, assaults on Jesus since the garden. He'd been walking, no sleep, he's no dehydrated, probably stripped, hands tied to this upright post. And the back, the buttocks, and the legs were scourged. One of the hottest points of debate, I was listening to an interview with the producer of The Passion, the scene in the movie where the centurion does this with his hand to tell him to flip him over and do some more. The producer didn't say it as much, but there was a little bit of artistic license with that, it seems. It would not be surprising, but it's not entirely clear that he was in that position. Probably was up like this through the whole process. The flagrum or the flagellum, that's what the instrument was for the scourging. Leather cords, 18 to 24 inches long. And if you take a soldier's arm about 2.5, 3 feet long, you add on another 2 feet, and you think about the force from here to the tip of the flagrum, a tremendous amount of force. And it was diabolically designed. The cords would have lead balls, and they would have these sharp objects, bone, glass, sharp metal. The balls were basically, for lack of a better term, kind of a tenderizer. They would contuse the tissue, the soft tissue. And then as the bruising develops, the tissues get inflamed, edematous, somewhat fluid-filled, then they're easier to lacerate, easier to cut with the sharp parts of the flagrum. This was indeed a Roman military exercise. There were 4 soldiers, characteristically a quaternion of 4 soldiers, that would carry this out. And what a perfect but very daunting name, the centurion. Whoever was in charge of the scourging was called the exactor mortis, the executor of death. Scourging was done. Those who did the scourging were called the lictors. There were usually 2 lictors, just as you would see in the movie, one on either side of the victim's back. Or occasionally, there would only be one, but he would change positions. And interestingly, if you read St. Faustina's diary, the visions that she had of the scourging, she said, her diary reports that there were 4 soldiers doing the scourging. And you can make a case for saying, as severe as this would have been, the term that I came across was a sadistic blessing. If he had not been scourged as much, would he have lived longer on the cross? And we'll come back to that as well. Jewish law also allowed scourging, but the Jewish law limited it to 39 lashes. If you go back to Deuteronomy, in Jewish law at that time said 40 lashes. But they changed it to 39 for a variety of reasons. One of them was counting errors. I don't know how you can discount from 39 to 40, but that was one of the rationale. And another was they wanted to show a sign of Jewish mercy. And they said 39 was a number that represented one from death. So they would stop at 39. They would do 13 to the back of the chest, 13 to the left shoulder, 13 to the right shoulder. Done. But this was a Roman scourging. Their goal was not to show mercy. Their goal was to near collapse, if not near death. That was the goal. During, after the scourging, well, frankly, from the moment he's arrested in the garden, he's being taunted, he's being mocked, he's being ridiculed. There are even ancient Greek texts, Seneca, Plutarch. There are great Greek texts that specifically mention that Jesus' scourging was, quote, particularly harsh compared to what they would otherwise see. And if you look at this from a modern medical standpoint, ATLS stands for Advanced Trauma Life Support. And when someone comes into the emergency room from a car wreck or penetrating injury, gunshot wound, you classify their amount of blood loss. Classes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Class 4 is the worst. You lose more than 40% of your blood volume in a hurry. And in all likelihood, that's what happened here. The crucifixion is relatively bloodless compared to what happened at the scourging. And you lose 40% of your blood volume. If you're 33 years old and you're healthy, but you lose 40% of your blood volume in a period of who knows how long this took prior to that and at the scourging, your blood pressure is low, your heart rate is high, you are disoriented, you are in shock. You're developing hypovolemic shock, your blood volume has dropped. You crown him with thorns, the mocking continues. He's robed, he's, so to speak, crowned. A wooden staff as if he's signifying a regal status is placed in his hand. Again, more sarcasm. The crown is placed on his head, but they take the staff and they hit the crown on the head, and the crown is full of, obviously, the crown of thorns. The nerves of the scalp, the occipital nerves, the auricular nerves, the nerves that go all over the scalp, are exceptionally sensitive. They're very superficial. You're literally just skin and bones around the crown of the head. The superficial temporal vessels. Put your fingers on the side of your temple, you'll feel a pulse. That's the temporal artery. Temporal artery gives you blood supply up the side of the head, all over this part. Arteries from the back of the head, from the brainstem coming around the back of the skull. Those are very, very rich vascular supply. That's why if you ever have a scalp laceration, they bleed like crazy. So more blood loss with this as well. What was the crown? Well, the crown probably was not a circular crown, like most depictions you'll see. It most likely was a helmet. The Ziziphus, there's a genus of trees in the Middle East called the Ziziphus. And the Ziziphus spina Christi has about 1-inch thorns. And if you see a picture of the tree from a distance, it looks like any other tree. It's not a big, huge tree, but if you strip all the leaves from it, it looks like a rose bush with a bad attitude. It's got these big, long thorns, and they're very, very rigid. And if you try to weave it in a circle, it won't go. But if you take it and you just kind of shape it, it's easier to turn it into a helmet shape than it is to a ring around the head. So probably it was more helmet shaped than ring shaped. The symbolism behind the robe and the crowns. It's described in writings as a scarlet robe, a red robe. And if you go back in the Old Testament, your sins will be like scarlet before you're made white as snow. Sin, scarlet representing sin. And the first time that thorns, thistles appear in the Old Testament is God telling Adam, after the fall, you will have to work the land. You'll be in the middle of thorns and thistles from here on out. So I think the symbolism is, the prophecies obviously come true with this. After this, he's taken back to Pilate at the Praetorium in front of the Jewish mob. Pilate, again, personal opinion, I really think he just didn't want this on the books. He didn't want anything to do with this. He tries to negotiate with the Sanhedrin and the Jewish mob. Okay, I've got these two guys. This guy's he's a murderer, revolutionary. You want me to keep him? Let me give you Jesus back. No, he finally releases Barabbas at that time. And if you look back in Deuteronomy, there's these passages in Deuteronomy that talks about if you find a dead animal or a dead body, but you don't know what happened. You have nothing to do with that event. There is a process of how you wash your hands and say this is not, literally you wash your hands of that crime or that scene. And in Roman tradition, there is really not a particularly significant relationship between washing your hands and not taking the blame. So was he doing this to try to play to the Jewish mob's emotions? Who knows? The cross. The reason I put the cross in quotes is probably one of the most contentious, previously I'll say, but still contentious debates. What did he carry? Did he carry a cross? How many times do you see this, just carrying the cross piece? This is a Zeffirelli movie from the 1970s, and you can see Jesus here, one of the thieves here, the third one is off screen there, but most of the time, this is what you see. 99.999% of the time is carrying the entire cross. So the procession to the crucifixion, sometime after about 9 a.m., was Jesus clothed? Did he have a robe? Did he have a loincloth? What probably did was clothed. If there was any sense of sensitivity, did the soldiers put a robe on him to carry the cross? The two thieves, traditionally known as Dismas and Gestas, now that dates from the 4th century, where their names are given, heading down the Via Dolorosa. Now the current route for the Via Dolorosa was marked in about the 16th century. So is it the exact route? Well, obviously, geography changes, the streets change, but it would have been a very crowded environment. Narrow streets, probably markets on either side. I have always been intrigued by the story of Simon. By the time Jesus starts carrying his cross, if you go back to Isaiah and you look at these passages and say he's not even recognizable anymore. You don't know who he is by how bad he looks. Here we are, 21st century. So what do? Cyrene to Jerusalem. Cyrene's in Libya, for Pete's sake. Well, okay, I Googled it. If you walk from Cyrene to Jerusalem, it's 1,120 miles. If you are traveling only during the daytime, by camel or donkey, which was long transit, you would average about 20 miles a day. So let's assume that Simon is coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. He has traveled 2 months to get there. He takes 2 months out of his life to do the most important 600 yards you could ever imagine with this. And I'm just so intrigued by that. Talk about right man, right place, right time. Okay, what did he carry? In all likelihood, he did not carry the entire cross. The entirety of the cross, even the smallest crosses then, would have weighed at least 250, 300 pounds. And so he probably carried only what we call the patibulum, the cross piece. And it was usually lashed to their arms. This is an illustration from that article from 1986. And which was adding insult to injury. The scourging wounds that would have been on the back, every time he'd move, this wood is rough, and it's reopening those wounds again. He's continuing to bleed. Did he collapse or did he fall? If you go to the original translations, it's not entirely clear that he collapsed under the weight of the patibulum. To leave the fortress of Antonia to get to Golgotha, this is a recreation model of what it would look like, there were these steps to go down. Theoretically, did he fall on the steps? You got your arms up like this, you're going down like a tree. You're not catching yourself. So he does it once, does it twice. They get Simon involved after the third time because he's going to knock himself out. And the Romans, the soldiers, the centurion, all they have to be sure of is that he doesn't die before he's crucified. They want to get him close, but he can't die until he's on the cross. So grab Simon, help him with that. Whether or not it was because he couldn't stand up or he or it was just giving way under the weight. Golgotha comes from the Aramaic word Golgotha, which means skull. Calvary, the Latin word Calvaria, means skull. And if we go back to that original map that we had up earlier, you look at all the roads going out and coming into Jerusalem, and that northwest side of the walled city, there are multiple roads going to larger towns around that area. This would be the equivalent of a crucifixion today at Brady and Kimberly, at that intersection. This is negative reinforcement to the Jewish citizens, to the Jewish people. This is what happens to you if you don't follow what we say. And in all likelihood, it's not a high point of debate that where Golgotha was and where Jesus' tomb was is underneath the current site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Think about this word next time you see it, excruciating. Excruciating is from the Latin excruciatus, literally out of the cross. So when you hear that term excruciating put out, this is where it becomes abundantly clear. Crucifixion didn't start with Jesus. Crucifixion was around for at least 500, 600 years prior to that. One of the most notorious leaders, Darius of Persia, when he conquered Babylon in about a 2 to 3 day period, crucified 3,000 Babylonians in a few days. Of course, Alexander the Great comes in, takes over that part of the world. He's learning. He finds out what Darius and the Persians are doing. He takes it back with him to Carthage in Egypt. The Romans learn it from there, and in true Roman fashion, how can we do this better? How can we make this perfect? One of the questions, was he crucified naked or not? Well, maybe. Does it matter? You think about the humiliation that goes with this. Not only is this happening to you, your mother's there, your friends are there. He probably had a loincloth on, but if they had the robe on him, had something on him as he carried the cross, as that comes off, all of the bleeding, all of the serous fluid, that yellowish fluid you see from scabs and all, is like glue. Take the robe off so the guards can divide it among themselves. You're opening the wounds again. He's continuing to bleed, continuing to bleed. What kind of cross was it? Maybe a minor point in the great scheme of things, but most likely it was what's called a tau cross, the crux commissa. It is a upright crossbar with nothing above the titulus, the sign on the top of it. Rather than ironically, a Latin cross, a crux commissa, which is got the upper part here. This is more likely what was used, and we'll talk about why that's more likely in a moment. The Tau cross was in Palestine at that time in history. The Tau cross seemed to be preferred. Geographically, there were variations, and frankly, sometimes it was up to the soldiers, the executioners, who was going to do it. Tau cross, Latin cross, you can be crucified on a tree. We all know about the crucifixion of some of the apostles and other saints on St. Andrew's cross, St. Peter being crucified upside down. The anatomy of the cross. The basic configuration of the cross, what the upright was called the stipe. Multiple crosses, the stipes. It probably was a permanent post in the ground. It was not taken out, it was left in the ground. Usually about 7 feet tall. The key was to keep the victim's feet off the ground. Now, took care of that with the nailing. The patibulum was secured to the stipe, and usually in kind of a mortise and tenon fashion. You'd have the stipe here with this peg at the top. The patibulum would have a slot tab A, slot B. That's what you get. You assemble it like this. Occasionally, they would use a sedile, sedulum, sometimes called a sedaculum. That's a little seat right here. That seat was not for comfort. That seat was to prolong the process. The less he had to work, the longer he would suffer. The suppedaneum, which is the foot plate, which you see here, and even up there in the crucifix on the wall, that was not very likely used. That became more common after that. And finally, the coup de grace was the titulus, with the patient, the victim's name and their crime on that board. And we'll come back to that. When he first gets there, before they start putting him on the patibulum, they start assembling the cross. They offer him wine with myrrh to drink. Or Mark, wine with myrrh, Matthew, wine with gall. Medicinally, it was considered a mild analgesic at that time. Were they giving it to him to make him feel more comfortable, offering it to him, or was it just another way of making fun of him? Saying, well, we're going to give you a wine, this is a big celebration. But he did not drink it, according to Matthew's Gospel. Thrown on his back, and ropes are taken off his arms, and the wrists are nailed to the patibulum. You've got these open wounds on your back, you're bleeding, you're thrown down on the ground. You're nailed to this thing. You've got dirt going up into the open wounds on your back. The wrists were nailed, not the hands. The wrists, at that time, the anatomists, the physicians, considered the wrist, what we consider the wrist, to be a part of the hand. The nails would have been in this area. Cadaver studies done with this, you can't, if you put a nail in the middle of the palm and you hang someone by that, hang a body by that, it is not strong enough to hold. Here it is strong enough to hold. And the anatomy itself, when I say radiocarpal or intercarpal, radiocarpal, the radius is the bone on the thumb side of your forearm. The carpal bones are the 8 small bones in the wrist. There is a space right there where you can go through, and you go back to the Old Testament, not a bone will be broken. No bones are broken. The periosteum, which is the covering of all the bones, is one of the most nerve-rich, sensitive tissues in your body. Think about when you hit your shin against the coffee table. You don't have any padding there, and you wonder you just broke your leg. Well, you didn't break your leg, you just hit your periosteum. It's a 5-alarm fire for pain. So, but it's like a location. It's a horrible location because not only is it effective for doing the crucifixion, but it's right at where the median nerve is at. Those of you who've had carpal tunnel problems, the median nerve is the nerve that goes to the thumb. These 2 fingers, half of this finger, incredibly sensitive for sensation, very important for muscle function to the hand as well. So almost undoubtedly had a median nerve injury. Dislocations, probably not. And we'll come to that in a little bit. If you watch in the Passion when they're pulling the arms out onto the cross, and you see him literally put his foot up in Jesus' armpit, and you see the shoulder kind of go like it's dislocated. Probably did not happen. You don't want them straight out like this. You got to have a little bit of give. You got to have almost like a wings on either side. And I looked for some image of lifting, literally lifting the patibulum with the victim nailed. Nothing else. Nail and then lift it up onto the stipe. Every representation is like what you see in the Passion. The stipe is slid into the hole in the ground as it's erected. But they were probably lifted up and then placed on the stipe. If you had a lower cross, you could get 4 strong soldiers, 2 on either side, lift it up, put them on the stipe. With a higher cross, they would use ladders, ropes, continuing to be taunted not just by the soldiers but by the Jewish leaders. How the feet were nailed to the stipe, that probably occurred once he was already hanging by his hands. The Romans strongly preferred nails to rope. They were usually nailed directly to the front of the stipe. An archaeological find, there's only one archaeological find of remains of a crucifixion victim from about the year 6 AD, a young Jewish man. Now his feet were nailed to the stipe from the side. The nail that went in through the heel bone to the side. but that was not usually the preferred means of doing it. And just like in the hand, you've got to find a place that you can hold, the nails will hold in the midfoot, the middle of the foot. You would, between all these multiple little bones, not so either there or up in here, you can go between the bones, not break any, but you still have good secure fixation with that. But as the nails progress through from the top to the bottom, here to there, the perineal nerve is the nerve that goes to the top of the foot, right over this region right there, out to the top of the toes. The plantar nerves are the ones that give you sensation at the bottom of your foot. They're going to be injured. The biggest blood vessel on the sole of the foot, the plantar arch, it's an arch of arteries that go around the foot, going to every single toe, probably was injured as well. The position of the legs with this, the feet were typically nailed to the front. This required his ankles to be flexed in a point position, plantar flexed, toe down position, flexed the knees, and the hips would either have to go out to the side or rotate in one direction or another. This is probably about the most accurate representation of what it would look like. Similar to this without the footrest. And to be able to breathe in this this is what would be termed a Y position. To be able to breathe, you had to do squats. You had to push against your feet. You had to pull against your hands. We'll talk about that, fellows. I love this image. This is probably more what it looked like too. This is the Pope's staff. Barbet was a physician in the early 20th century, one of the first to really do detailed work on researching this. This was the model he had made, what he felt it probably looked like. The titulus crucis is the plate. It is a legal document. In the new international version, it describes the written code, the NASB certificate of debt. It has the name and the charges. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In Latin, in Greek, and in Hebrew. Latin, Greek. And this representation, it was felt that it was gypsum written on a board, and all the letters were strung together without spaces because they didn't have enough room for all the letters to leave the spaces in there. This is what we would call paradoxical respiration. When you breathe in, you need muscles to do that. To breathe out, you just have to relax. It doesn't take any effort. This is just the opposite. The only way that you can inhale is to let yourself drop. And when you do that, you bring your arms up, the volume of your chest gets bigger, a lower pressure pulls in air. But eventually you've got to exhale. And the only way to exhale is to pull yourself up again. And and your diaphragm is the only muscle that can really do that in that position. And your diaphragm is not very effective at exhaling. It's meant to inhale. So you're developing hypercarbia, high carbon dioxide in your blood, muscle cramps, heart rate's getting fast too. So that brings us to these 7 last words. And there are only a couple I want to highlight with this. These first 3, number 2, with Dismas, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, is the Hebrew translation for, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the only time in Jesus' time on earth that he did not address God as his Father. This was the ultimate abandonment from sin. Number 5, thirst. Hoxa was a concoction made popular with the peasants and the Roman legionnaires. It was wine vinegar fermented from grape juice and water. It was a leavening process. Leaven in the Old Testament also was symbolic of sin. Why do we have unleavened bread? And leavening is the equivalent of sin. And very symbolically, the sponge with the pox on it was on a hyssop stalk. During Passover, when the lamb's blood is put on the doorposts, it's traditional to use a hyssop stalk to do that. It's finished, or the Greek translation tetelestai literally means paid in full. Ancient papyrus found that the receipts of taxes being paid, the tax collector writes on there paid in full, writes tetelestai. So it wasn't that Jesus was finished. It is finished. All the debts are paid. And into your hands I commend my spirit. Some authors will say this was the ultimate work of divinity.
He let himself die. He said, time to die. I can't, maybe that's true. When I finally climb out of purgatory, I'll get back to you on that one. But you think about where we started with this and where we are now. From a physical standpoint, this was a physical death, in my opinion, not a death by will. 3 hours of darkness, noon to 3 o'clock while he's on the cross. The average high temperature in Jerusalem, first week of April, was 70 degrees. So many depictions you see, it looks like a desert, it looks like it's hot. The average high temperature is 70 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 hours of darkness, that temperature is going to drop a lot. And one of the things that contributes to the progression of shock is hypothermia. Your temperature drops, you develop blood clotting issues, coagulopathies, you may bleed more, you may clot more. So over that 3 hour period of time, he took on the symbolic darkness from the Old Testament. That was God's judgment over the people. Moses bringing darkness over Egypt. The right side was almost assuredly the one that was pierced through the fifth intercostal space, which would be right about here, between the fifth and sixth ribs. It allows penetration of the chest wall, the lower part of the right lung, and into the right atrium and the right ventricle. The Shroud of Turin seems to represent that as well. Blood and water. There have been some authors that say that blood and water, well, therefore we must have an abdominal wound. It's got to be the bladder or something like that. No. Blood and water can come from this wound. Now, in the Greek translation, blood and water doesn't mean the order it came out. If it was in the order it came out, would be water and blood. Pleural fluid, pericardial fluid would look like water. Blood is blood. In this instance, the Greeks, when they say this, they don't mean it in order of sequence, they mean it in order of prominence. There was more blood than water that came from this. And as we generally understand and appreciate, Christ was dead before this happened. Multiple attempts to try to recreate the crucifixion. How are you going to do that? I mean, ethically, it's not going to happen. We talked about the cadaver studies. This is a Swiss investigator about 10 years ago. These were also, his subjects were strapped. He had EKGs on him, blood pressure cuffs. They were strapped down here. None of them lasted more than about 5 or 6 minutes. It was just too uncomfortable, too painful for that. They did have trouble breathing, but nobody had any ill effects. This is from the ATLS. This is the death triad, what's often known as the lethal triad or Virchow's triad, where you have trauma, you get blood vessel injury, your platelet count drops, you get a low blood pressure. Interestingly, in Galilean Jews, there is an increased incidence of factor V problems. Factor V is a clotting factor. That can either be you can have too much clotting or too little clotting, depending upon the abnormality. Suspension trauma, if you mountain climbers that are suspended by a rope, nobody around to help them, they will die, but it's not because they're swinging back and forth. All the blood ends up pooling in their legs. They have nothing to push down. So if the muscles are not pumping the blood back up, they can die literally from the low blood pressure. A cardiac cause, perhaps. Stroud's original work said that Jesus died of a broken heart. And literally died of a broken heart. His supposition was that if you have a bad heart attack or contusion, the wall of the ventricle becomes kind of necrotic. Now this is not likely because it takes a longer time than a few hours. But the muscle breaks down, becomes necrotic, and the force of the ventricle just literally ruptures out through the wall of the heart. To some degree, this has something to do with it. We'll come back to that. Death by suspension was a horrible torture used initially in the Austro-Hungarian War. The Nazis used it at Dachau. You're just suspended by your arms. Arms overhead, tied to the ceiling until you're dead. And it usually took about 3 hours for that to happen. Did the lance cause the death of Christ? Very debatable. So the most likely cause is a combination of this, the hypovolemic shock, and what we would be best called exhaustion, asphyxia. You're breathing only because your arms and legs are working, not because your lungs are working the way they're supposed to. He's dehydrated, so number one, he's got blood loss. Number two, he's not at any fluid replenishment. Number three, with decreased blood volume, your heart rate has to go up. Your heart is working over the time. And the sacrificial lamb, when the Jews would sacrifice a lamb, They would slit its throat, hang it upside down, drain out all the blood. You could not have blood in the meat. And literally, as much, well, not figuratively, literally, I believe that's what happened with Christ on the cross as well, the scourging of the cross. The Crucifixion did not happen to Christ because they found he was dead, or in the Greek skalpopia, they would come and break the legs of the two thieves. But again, back to the Old Testament, not a bone will be broken. After the death, the earthquake occurs, the veil in the temple is torn in half. It was customary for the corpse to be left on the cross, not to be taken down. And again, a further deterrent to the people that were there or the people that were coming into town. Don't mess with us. But you had to get permission. Fortunately, Joseph of Arimathea had his connections. He had permission. The Jews did not want a Jewish body out there after sunset because that was when the Sabbath would start. And that would be a sacrilege. And he's taken to the tomb at the Holy Sepulchre. Wrapped in the linen. And interestingly, about the only, we're getting too close to the end here finally, about the only representation of the crucifixion before 420 AD was satirical. In about 250 AD, it was found in the 1800s, on the Palatine Hill in Rome, in an archaeological dig, there is a depiction of a man's body with a donkey's head on a cross. It's called the Alexamenos graffito. It is graffiti on a wall, making fun of someone whose name was Alexamenos. It shows him with his hands like this in front of a cross with a man with a donkey's head. It was satire. It was making fun of the crucifixion. And if you think about it, you would go and talk to someone to evangelize and say, I want you to know about a guy who died on a cross. Credibility would be a little bit strained in that situation. So, this is the first representation. This is an ivory carving that tells, it's a beautiful telling in one little piece of ivory from 1,600 years ago, 1,700 years ago. Here's Christ on the cross. Here's Longinus, the centurion. If you really want to read something interesting, read about the life of Saint Longinus, the centurion who appears to. Here's centurion. Here's John. Here's Mary. This is Judas hanging. The only one who looks to be suffering here is Judas. Jesus has got a very placid look on his face. And the first time it shows up in a manuscript, this is found in Syria from 586 AD, the Rapula Gospels. Jesus, and the whole story's here. Here's the soldiers dividing the garment. Here's the lance. Here's the hyssop stalk with the paxa on it. The ladies of Jerusalem, John and Mary. The story, the first really artistic representation in manuscript. So, this is a whole other story. We won't go there either, but I like to show this picture. You saw this image at the beginning of the talk. This intrigues me. When you take the shroud and you do a 3D reconstruction of it, based on this is what Jesus' face would have looked like at the time of his death. And another project done with this imaging, with the technology. You know how if you have a child that's lost now, and it's been years, and they age that child. So what would that child look like now? They reverse that. There's an image, if you look it up in the shroud, an image of Jesus at what he would look like based on this at 8 or 9 years of age. Fascinating picture. But this image here, it's a whole other topic. Is it the shroud? Is it the burial cloth of Christ? I believe it is. It fits much more so than metaphorically. Literally fits with what we think we know and what we do know about the crucifixion. But maybe that'll take me another 2 years to work up the courage to talk about that one. So anyway, and then the final story. All right. I thank you for your attention. Are there any